Perek Lamed, chapter 30 of Tanya, on page 76, or the English page 136. The Beinani is told that he has to take into consideration the statement of the sages, take to heart the statement of the sages, to be humble before all people. And this is accomplished by judging, not by accomplishment and by position, the difference between himself and the lowest of the low, but rather by judging effort and devotion and sacrifice in the service of God. That which we expect of the lowest of the low, that he should overcome all the temptations and all the exposure that he has to unholy things, both in the outside world, in his physical surroundings, and also within himself, that he happens to have a Yetzer Hara that is very demanding and very passionate, and yet we expect him to overcome all of this because of his Yirah Shamayim, because of his fear of God. The Beinani then has to ask himself whether he is capable of that kind of effort, of that kind of struggle. How can he know this? By taking a look in his own behavior to see if he puts in that kind of struggle in those areas where he needs to struggle. As for example in davening. Now, on page 76, 2/3 of the way down. And anyone who will find that he has not reached this level, in that he doesn't struggle with his body, such an intense struggle, such a difficult battle, in order to be able to daven properly, then then he has not yet reached not even to the ballpark, not even to the same category of struggle as the one who struggles against his Yetzer, that burns like an inflamed fire, who we expect to be subdued and submissive, and to overcome this desire because of his fear of God. And the fact that the Beinani is struggling to daven, whereas the lowest of the low is struggling with ugly sin, this shouldn't make any difference at all, because in terms of worthiness, in terms of virtue, the Mishnah says that who is a gibber, who is considered strong, who has virtue, hamizgaber al yitzrei, a person who overcomes his yetzer. And the Baal Shem Tov emphasizes that it's yitzrei, it's his yetzer. If he overcomes his temptation, then he's a gibber. If he overcomes temptation that other people have, that is not his main temptation, then he's not such a gibber. So, for example, if a person has a Yetzer Hara that is basically a passionate Yetzer Hara, and indulges in its passions and in its pleasures, but he overcomes the anger within him, then he's not a gibber, because anger is not his Yetzer. Or, if on the other hand, the person's Yetzer is primarily an angry one, but he overcomes his taivas, he overcomes his temptations, then also he is not a gibber, because he's not overcoming his Yetzer. And therefore, whether your Yetzer happens to be the disinclination to daven, or the Yetzer happens to be a temptation to commit a sin, it's all the same in terms of personal virtue and personal strength. The same is true also in terms of benching, that the Beinani has to ask himself whether he puts in an effort in the benching. And so on also with all brachas that are made over foods that have to be said with kavanah, and also the mitzvahs, the bracha of the mitzvah and the act of the mitzvah, all of this has to be performed with proper kavanah. And certainly to do a mitzvah for its own sake, to do it lishma, which is the ultimate kavanah, this is a difficult battle, and he has to judge himself whether he puts in the kind of battle necessary that would make him equal in his struggle to the struggle of the lowest of the low. And also in the study of Torah, whether he learns more than his desire and will and nature and habit. If he learns a little bit more, then it's a slight battle, a little struggle. But if he tries to learn a lot more than his nature, desire, and habit allow, this would be al yedei milchama atzuma im gufei. This would be with a difficult, intense battle equal to the battle of the lowest of the low. Ki halemed ma'at yesem mitivei, because the person who learns a little bit more than his nature allows, harei ze milchama ktano, this is a little battle, ve'ein lo erech v'dimyin, not comparable at all in milchemes hayetzer, with the struggle of the lowest of the low, who fights with his yetzer hara habeyer ko'esh, that is burning like a fire. Mikre rasha gamur, and he would be called a rasha im einim menatzeach yitzrei, if he were not to overcome his yetzer hara, liyes nichna v'nishbar mepnei Hashem, to make his yetzer hara submissive and subdued before God. And although a person can say all of this is in positive mitzvahs, what the Beinani fails to do, it's in the kavan of the mitzvah, in the kavan of the bracha, in the kavan of the davening. But the lowest of the low is failing in sur mirah, in avoiding sin. And it appears, for technical reasons, that doing a sin is more serious than not doing a mitzvah. So the Rebbe says, Umali b'chinas sur mirah, umali b'chinas v'asei teiv. What difference is it whether it's avoiding the evil or doing good? Hakeil hi mitzvahs hamelech hakodesh yachid u'miyuchad baruch hu. Either way, the positive mitzvah, the negative mitzvah, it is the mitzvah of the Eibishter, who is one and only, and therefore within him his desires and his commandments, whether it's a positive or negative mitzvah, are really all one, because God is indivisible. Chein b'shar mitzvahs, the same is true also with other mitzvahs. The Beinani has to see and check whether he puts in the proper effort. And particularly when it comes to money matters, giving tzedakah, etc., whether he puts out the effort necessary to overcome his natural inclination towards money or disinclination to spending money and so on. So all of this is in the positive. And there's no difference between the positive and the negative. Either way, it's God's will. But even the Beinani, if he looks hard enough, can find that he is also not perfect in avoiding the evil. In Sur Mirah, although a Beinani does not sin and is technically incapable of sinning, yet on a subtle level, he can find where he is not perfect in his avoidance of the evil. Now, even in the category of Sur Mirah, of avoiding sin, Yochil kol ish maskil limtze benafshe, every intelligent person can find within himself she'ein neisor ligamri mehara, that he does not completely avoid the evil. He's not completely turned away from it, bakel mikel kel, completely, totally, thoroughly. In those areas which would demand a difficult, intense battle, equal or comparable to the battle of the lowest of the low, and even where there's less of a battle necessary, he still does not put in the effort and avoid it completely. What, for example? For example, to interrupt in middle of a pleasant conversation or a story that shows the fault or that is an embarrassment to his friend, even if it's a very slight embarrassment, and even if it's true, and even if he's saying it in order to cleanse himself, to clear his own reputation, as is known, from that which Reb Shimon said to his father. Rabbeinu HaKodesh, Lav ano kasvei ela Yehuda chayto kasvei. Rabbeinu HaKodesh came home and found a manuscript on halacha. And he read it through and found that there was a mistake in it, a halachic mistake. And he assumed that his son, Reb Shimon, had written it. So when he pointed out the mistake to Reb Shimon, to his son, Reb Shimon said, I didn't write it, Yehuda the tailor wrote it. The Amalei, and his father, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, said to him, Klach me Lashon Hara, avoid Lashon Hara. And although it wasn't literally Lashon Hara, and it had all the ingredients mentioned before, it was a very slight insult to the tailor, because it's not such a great insult that a tailor should make a mistake in halacha that would be noticed or caught by Rabbeinu HaKodesh, who was the author of the Mishnah. And also, it was true. It was true that Yehuda the tailor had written it and not Reb Shimon. And thirdly, Reb Shimon was saying it in order to clear himself. And yet his father says to him, avoid Lashon Hara, because he could have said, I didn't write it, and leave it at that. Ayin Sham B'Gemara Reish Perek Yud, the Bava Basra. And there are other such examples. Tishchich B'Tuva, that are very common, and particularly in the mitzvah of refraining from what is permissible, which is a mitzvah from the Torah, as it says, you should be holy and you should make yourself holy. And also in the rabbinic mitzvahs, in the Rabbanon, which are also not to be taken lightly, because in some ways the rabbinic prohibitions are more severe than the Torah prohibitions. So in all of these areas that Beinani can find where he is not completely clear of sin, he's not completely free of sin, wherever there is a need for a battle. Elo shekol elu ki yetzu bohen hein me'aveinu sheha'adam dosh ba'akavov. These sins and other such sins are the kinds of things that a person doesn't notice. He steps on them, he doesn't notice them, and therefore to stop and take notice and change takes an effort. You have to go out of your way. And another reason that it is difficult to avoid these things is because they had been committed so often already, they had become so natural because of the repetition that it becomes difficult even to motivate yourself to want to try and stop doing it, since it has already become a natural part of your behavior. So on the one hand, these are slight sins, the kinds of things that people barely even notice. But on the other hand, aval be'emes, but the truth is that im hu yedei sefer u'machzik b'teiras Hashem, if he knows how to learn, even though he's a businessman, but he does know how to learn, u'machzik b'teiras Hashem, or if he spends his time in study of Torah, he's a yeshiva student, and he is involved in the service of Daveda, of godliness. He seeks a closeness to God. Then then his sin is too great to bear, and his fault is doubly, quadruply worse than the lowest of the low, in the fact that he doesn't battle with his Yetzer Hara and overcome his Yetzer Hara be'erech u'bechinas mulchama atzuma hanal, with the same struggle and with the same effort as is expected of the lowest of the low, his fault and his unworthiness is greater than ashmas kal shebekalim yesh ve'kronis, than the fault of the low, not the sin, but the fault of the lowest of the low, who sits in the street corners, who are far from God and far from Torah. And therefore their guilt is not that great. In the guilt of not overcoming the Yetzer Hara, which is an inflamed fire, by the awareness of God's presence and the fear of God, who looks and watches all that they do, their guilt is not as great as the guilt and the fault of those who are closer to God, and to the Torah, and to the service of God. And the closer one is, the greater is the fault, and the greater is the guilt in the failure to serve God properly. As the Gemara says concerning Acher, etc., who had studied and knew and understood, had been close to godliness, and then spitefully turned away, that is worse than a person who had never known. And that's why the sages say, Al Amei Ha'aretz, concerning the ignorant, who hadn't learned that their intentional sins are considered unintentional sins. And so Perek Lamed, in chapter 30 of Tanya, the Rebbe says that a Beinani, or any Jew, has to feel himself inferior to all other people, even people who externally in their behavior are far worse off than the Beinani himself, than ourselves. Yet, in judging properly, we consider not the achievement or the accomplishment, but rather the amount of effort that went into achieving and accomplishing. And therefore, if we don't put in the effort that we expect of the lowest of the low, and the intense battle that he would have to engage in order to overcome his Yetzer Hara, to be able to serve God properly, if we don't put in that kind of an effort, then how can we be certain that were we exposed to the conditions and the circumstances of the lowest of the low, how can we assume that we would put in the effort then to not do the sins that we condemn the lowest of the low for committing? How do we know that we wouldn't be as bad or maybe even worse? All of this is intended to break the complacency and the smugness of the animal soul in order to free the heart to be able to be responsive and sensitive to godly and delicate matters. In Hayom Yom, for the fourth day of Adar, the Rebbe says that the beginning and the preparation for involvement and for working at understanding any deep subject, and particularly a godly subject, the understanding of a godly subject, consists of two parts. One is an effort necessary, a struggle with the body, with the flesh, and that is to remove the pleasure that one senses and feels in worldly things, in physical things. And two, an effort and a struggle with the nefesh, and that is to arouse within the nefesh a taste and an appreciation, a pleasure for intelligence, for muskalis, and particularly a pleasure for the godliness or the godly subjects and the understanding of godliness.